The snow fell in thick, silent sheets over the ruins of a Soviet village just outside Stalingrad. It was January 1942, and the temperature had dropped to 20 degrees below zero. Sergeant Hans Keller stood alone in what used to be a schoolyard, his rifle hanging loose at his side. Around him lay the bodies of 17 civilians, their blood already frozen into dark pools on the white ground. Most were women. 3 were children. Hans had not pulled the trigger, but he had been there when it happened, and he had done nothing to stop it. Now, as the wind howled through the shattered buildings, and his breath came out in short, visible bursts, he wept. Not quietly, not with dignity. He wept the way a man weeps when something inside him breaks beyond repair. Before we continue, hit that subscribe button right now if you believe these stories need to be told. These aren't just history lessons, they're warnings about what happens when good people stay silent. And drop in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to know how far these forgotten voices are traveling. Are you in New York? São Paulo? London? Warsaw? Let me know you're here. If you've ever wondered what it takes to shatter a soldier's soul, to push a man past the point where orders and duty mean anything at all, then you need to hear what happened in that frozen village. Because what Hans Keller witnessed that day wasn't just another casualty of war. It was something that would haunt him until his last breath. Something that would make him question everything he'd been told about honor, about following orders, about what it means to be human. Comment below if you think a soldier can ever truly recover from something like this, or if some wounds are meant to stay open forever. Hans was 23 years old. He had joined the Wehrmacht in 1939, believing what many young Germans believed, that he was serving his country, that the war would be quick, that there was glory in the fight. By the time his unit reached the outskirts of Stalingrad in late 1941, those beliefs had already started to crack. But nothing prepared him for what would happen on that January morning. The question isn't just what he saw. The question is why he didn't walk away, why he stayed silent, and what it cost him to live with that silence. But to understand why Hans wept in that schoolyard, you need to know what brought him there in the first place. The Battle of Stalingrad was not yet the inferno it would become by summer. In January 1942, German forces were still advancing, still confident, still convinced they could take the city and break Soviet resistance. Hans Keller's unit, part of the 6th Army, had been pushing through small villages and towns on the western approach to Stalingrad. The cold was brutal. Men lost fingers and toes to frostbite. Supplies were irregular. The further they moved into Soviet territory, the more the landscape seemed to swallow them whole. Stop scrolling for just 5 seconds and subscribe to this channel if you think the world needs to remember stories like Hans Keller's. Click that button and tell me in the comments what city you're listening from right now. Are you in Berlin, Moscow, Chicago, Tokyo? I read every single comment and I want to know where you are when you hear these words. Don't just watch, participate. Hans had been a good soldier. He followed orders. He didn't ask questions. He wrote letters home to his mother in Bavaria, telling her he was safe, that the war would be over soon, that he missed her cooking. He didn't tell her about the bodies he'd seen along the roadsides, the burned villages, the eyes of Russian prisoners staring at nothing. He didn't tell her that he'd stopped sleeping more than 2 hours at a time. The village they entered on January 14th didn't even have a name on their maps. It was just another cluster of wooden houses and a small church with a collapsed roof. The inhabitants hadn't fled. Maybe they had nowhere to go. Maybe they thought the Germans would pass through without incident. Hans's commanding officer, Lieutenant Werner Brandt, was a career soldier, 38 years old, with a reputation for efficiency and coldness. He didn't waste time. When the unit arrived, he ordered a sweep of every building. They were looking for partisans, for weapons, for anyone who might pose a threat. They found an old man hiding a Soviet flag in his cellar. They found a woman with a radio. And they found, in the schoolhouse, a group of villagers who had gathered there for warmth. 17 people, mostly women and elderly. 3 children, the youngest maybe 5 years old. Lieutenant Brandt decided they were partisan sympathizers. There was no trial, no questions, just an order. Hans stood with 5 other soldiers in the schoolyard as Brandt gave the command. The villagers were lined up against the wall. Some of them prayed. One woman held her daughter and sang softly. Hans felt his hands shaking. He looked at the other soldiers. None of them moved. None of them spoke. When the order came to fire, Hans didn't raise his rifle, but 2 others did. The sound was deafening in the cold air, echoing off the broken buildings. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, then silence, then the wind. Hans doesn't remember Brandt leaving. He doesn't remember the other soldiers walking away. He only remembers standing there as the snow began to cover the bodies, as the blood stopped steaming in the cold. He remembers thinking that he should have said something, should have done something, but the thought came too late and felt too small against what had just happened. That's when he started to cry. Not because he was sad, not because he was afraid, but because something fundamental had torn loose inside him, something that told him the difference between right and wrong, between human and monster. And he realized, standing in that schoolyard, that he had crossed a line just by watching, just by staying silent, just by being there. Write in the comments what you would have done in Hans's place. Would you have spoken up, knowing it might cost you your life? Or would you have stayed silent, like he did? Hans Keller didn't speak for 3 days after the massacre. His unit moved on, deeper into Soviet territory, and he moved with them like a ghost. He ate when food was available. He marched when they marched. But inside, something had shut down. The other soldiers noticed, but said nothing. In war, silence is common. Trauma is everywhere. No one has time to ask questions. But Hans couldn't stop seeing their faces. The woman who sang to her daughter. The old man who tried to shield the children with his own body. The way the snow had kept falling, indifferent and pure, covering everything. At night, when he closed his eyes, he heard the gunshots again. He heard the singing. He heard nothing at all, which was somehow worse. By February, his unit was pulled back for resupply. They spent 2 weeks in a captured Soviet barracks, waiting for new orders. It was during this time that Hans did something no one expected. He went to the battalion chaplain, a man named Father Dietrich, and confessed what he had witnessed. Father Dietrich was in his 50s, grey-haired and weary, a man who had seen enough of the war to know that words like sin and redemption had become almost meaningless. But he listened, and when Hans finished, Father Dietrich asked him a single question. Do you believe you can still be forgiven? Hans didn't know the answer. He wanted to believe in forgiveness, in redemption, in the possibility that a man could come back from something like this. But he also knew that forgiveness required acknowledging guilt, and guilt required action. He hadn't pulled the trigger, but he had been complicit. He had let it happen, and in the moral calculus of war, that might be worse than pulling the trigger himself. Father Dietrich gave him no easy answers. He told Hans that some wounds don't heal, that some things a man has to carry for the rest of his life. But he also told him that the measure of a man isn't whether he falls, but whether he tries to stand back up. Hans left that conversation with no absolution, no peace, but with something else, a decision. He couldn't undo what had happened in that schoolyard, but he could refuse to let it happen again. Over the following months, as the battle for Stalingrad intensified, and the German Sixth Army began its slow, grinding descent into catastrophe, Hans Keller changed. He began to sabotage small orders, to warn civilians when his unit was approaching, to look the other way when Soviet prisoners tried to escape. It wasn't heroism. It wasn't resistance. It was something quieter and more desperate. A man trying to reclaim his humanity, one small act at a time. He didn't save everyone. He couldn't. But he saved some. And in the frozen hell of Stalingrad, where death was everywhere and mercy was rare, that mattered. Hans survived the battle, barely, and was captured by Soviet forces in February 1943. He spent 8 years in a labor camp in Siberia. When he finally returned to Germany in 1951, he was a different man. Thin, quiet, haunted. He never married. He never spoke publicly about what he'd seen. But every January 14th, until his death in 1989, he lit a candle and sat in silence for 17 minutes. 1 minute for each person who died in that schoolyard. 1 minute for each face he could never forget. War breaks people in different ways. For some, it's the violence. For others, it's the silence. Hans Keller wept in a frozen schoolyard because he learned too late that being a good soldier and being a good man are not always the same thing. If this story moved you, leave a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. History isn't just about battles and dates. It's about the moments that test who we really are. If Hans Keller's story shook something loose in you, if it made you think about the weight of silence and the cost of complicity, then subscribe to this channel because there are hundreds more stories like this one that deserve to be heard. And answer me this in the comments. What city are you in right now as you finish watching this? Los Angeles? Manchester? Sydney? Istanbul? I want to see how many places around the world are listening to these voices from the past. Write it down. Let me know you were here.